Hi, you're listening to Tangents, a brand new podcast from Coin Center. I'm Peter Van Valkenburg, Director of Research at Coin Center, and I'm hosting this episode. It's my great honor to speak with a guy who I've started admiring a lot on Twitter, despite us having some dissimilar interests, but also some very similar interests. Rohan Grey. Rohan, welcome to Tangents. Why don't you tell our audience a little bit about where you're at right now and what got you interested in digital money, which is going to be the topic of the show.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me. So I'm currently an incoming professor of law at the University of Willamette in Oregon. I teach contracts, securities regulation, business organizations. I was a doctoral fellow at Cornell Law School, where my doctoral work is focusing on the legal design of digital currency. I'm just finishing up that now with COVID. We pushed things back a bit. I'm also the president of the Modern Money Network, which does public education around money and finance from an MMT kind of informed perspective. And I work with the International Telecommunications Union's working group on digital currency. I also am what they call a network manager or network evangelist for the Freedom Box Foundation, which is a nonprofit that puts together privacy-respecting software and sort of usable hardware, cheap hardware devices, which I got to through my old law professor Eben Moglen, which was one of the first people that sort of introduced me to the technology side of things.
That's awesome. Cool. So for those of you who listened to our first episode with Start9 and their personal server vision, sort of like they owe a fair amount of the sort of intellectual motivation to early work that was done by Moglen in this space and work that was done in an actual production sense from the Freedom Box guys. I remember probably back when I was in law school, so we're talking like 2011-ish, starting to dive into the Freedom Box stuff and then getting distracted by contracts exams. Just like I started to dive into the Bitcoin mining stuff around that time and then got distracted by contracts exams. Damn, contracts exams have ruined everything. And I hadn't kept up with them. Yeah. So hopefully maybe we can talk a little bit more about what Freedom Box is up to more recently.
Sure.
I wanted to start out just talking about this notion that we should have anonymous or cash-like public money. So our audience knows Bitcoin. Our audience probably knows Zcash and Monero, which are more anonymous versions of Bitcoin. You and I have chatted on Twitter about how I feel like these are public networks because they're open to anybody and anybody can run the software and get the benefit of a payment address to receive payments for free without intellectual property. But you've pushed back, and I don't think you're wrong to push back, that it's not really public money, because public money in the macroeconomic sense or maybe in the MMT sense means something a little bit different. So what does that look like to you?
Yeah, sure. So I think the first thing is, when I use the word public there, I'm talking about it specifically in terms of institutions and structures that are designed to be public in the sense of all-encompassing. So public in the sense of any political community, everybody is included in that. And I think that's a little bit different to what I would think of as open, or maybe even civil society, entities where it isn't designed, to necessarily be exclusive, but that it isn't designed to be universal and as a core part of sort of a social construct that you not only can enter into, but also can't enter out of. So just to give an example, I could create, a Dungeons and Dragons game and invite as many people as I want to, because that's in my imagination space, right? That's something that I could make as open as I wanted to. But I think that's a different kind of dynamic than describing, for example, the issues that come up when we think about ecological sustainability on the planet. I don't have the right to not be intertwined with you. I don't have the right to consider the planet something external to me. When we talk about the planet and climate as a public good, we're talking about it as something that affects everybody. And I think the difference with that and, sort of private communities where they can be quite open is that concept of what it means to be a democracy, what it means to be participatory, what it means to be inclusive and universal.
Interesting. So I feel like I'm getting like a James Buchanan club goods versus true public goods kind of take on this, right?
Yeah, and I think the club goods idea has some exclusivity components there that I wouldn't want to sort of overemphasize with respect to things like Bitcoin. I do think that a lot of these things that call themselves public have a governance structure, and that elements of that governance structure are not public, or are not what I would call publicly accountable. But that's a little bit different to sort of the way that the protocol is designed to work.
Interesting. Yeah. No. So Angela Walsh, are you familiar with Angela?
She's a friend of mine. Yeah.
Oh, awesome. I'm so glad, because she's done awesome work keeping a lot of us crypto folks more honest. Not that we're not inherently honest, but
no. Look, the pitch and the spin is important. I understand.
So yeah, Angela does an excellent job elucidating what otherwise might go unelucidated because of marketing speak or just technological overexuberance, which is these networks like Bitcoin, they don't arrive fully formed from God or from science and the universe. They aren't pure math. They are designed systems that also continue to need updating and maintenance. And that process of updating and maintenance is in some ways, private process. And then the question arises, who are these individuals involved in that process? And are they accountable in some way? And Angela jumps to fiduciary liability, perhaps, for coders, which I think is a gross overstep. All respect to Angela, of course. I just think from a legal standpoint, maybe we'd start with tort liability instead of fiduciary liability. But I guess my response often to Angela, who we should definitely have on this podcast, by the way, and my response to you with respect to sort of the exclusion, public goods versus club goods, is it's open source software. So yes, there is a somewhat, it's not for lay people. It's not easy, but there's this possibility for anybody to join that development process and contribute in a transparent way. And then there's this process where people choose which software they want to run, your updates or some other person's updates, especially if they're in conflict with each other. And that is in many ways a democratically accountable process that actually, and your work with Moglin, I think, might implicate some of this as well, might be more democratic than a lot of our actual, government institutions.
Well, first of all, I don't have much, need to defend existing democratic institutions. I don't think that's my point. But I think this idea that like a right of exit is tantamount, or a right of kind of entry is tantamount to democratic voice, I just don't buy, because first of all, the software is open source, but the trademark isn't. And even the nodes aren't, in the sense that we are talking about a system devised of a series of finite units or finite actors. And each of those actors have control over a part of that system. And you can describe a machine where I can always add more wheels. But if each wheel is owned by somebody, then what we are talking about is a machine that's comprised of a series of privately owned wheels. We're not talking about a public bus. And I think it's different to describe a system where, I can add a node, I can take away a node, I can submit requests. But if I'm running the GitLab master code base, I have a kind of control that you as an outsider don't have. I have a kind of influence. And I think at a second level, this is mistaking the code base for the infrastructure. And I think this is where Angela, I do agree with her, which is, financial market infrastructure is not just software. It's not just me running, VLC media player on my laptop. It's running infrastructure that has social implications. This is the equivalent of building roads in the air and then inviting people to drive on them. Yep. That has implications for public safety. And I don't think that those implications can be reduced to, if you don't like it, don't use it. I didn't like the money market mutual fund share industry, but it did a lot of damage to the world, whether or not I used it. And if Bitcoin, or any particular node, any particular iteration of Bitcoin, any particular, thing that has a set of, actors who control keys to change things and other people don't control those keys, and that governance process exists. Anything like that gains any systemic importance in the payment system is going to be affecting people who did not consent to that practice, did not consent to those processes. And I think the idea that like, if you don't like it, you don't have to use it, or if you don't like it, you can switch to another node is overly reductive in understanding what democratic voice and participation should be understood in a society.
I think I don't strongly disagree at all. Network effects can be extremely powerful, especially with something like currency, which is one word to describe network effects. It is the thing with currency, the thing that everyone will accept, or the thing that everyone will pay with. But I guess my response is just comparing the free and open source development process to the process of lobbying Congress to pass a law, to tell the Treasury to create a technology, to offer a digital money. These are both imperfect processes, and they both have certain checks and balances inherent in them. And so I'm not saying one is better or worse. There's shortcomings in both, but I see both as being processes that are driven towards an end, which is this is a public good. This is something that is created for everyone, and has some method of checking those in power to guarantee that remains. That negative externalities, like you made the climate change analysis, are addressed and policed in some way, or that positive externalities are manifested. Anybody can create an address. You don't have to pay in Bitcoin in order to make a Bitcoin payment address. You just have the benefit of a wallet right away if someone wants to pay you.
So I wouldn't use the terms, market externalities or network effects. I think these are terms that start with a presumption of a market system that is based in a kind of neoclassical economic logic I don't think is accurate. So I don't think that ecological economics is the problem with ecological sustainability is a market externality. The problem is it's a public governance issue. There is no market that failed to incorporate this, that if it had incorporated it, we wouldn't need public governance. Public governance is the beginning point, and you set up market institutions to the extent they support that public governance. So I think that's a fundamental difference of opinion there. And when it comes to the effects of these systems, I'm not just talking about network effects. Like you could say, for example, there are network effects to do with the use of social media. That's a different thing to saying that financial market infrastructure serves a public economic service, right? You could be quite agnostic whether social media shuts down. Maybe you're less agnostic if you rely on that social media to send out emergency fire warnings, right? So that's at a point at which something...
Or the president starts tweeting things like pardons.
Yeah,
or something
exactly,
like that.
exactly, right. But my point is that there's a difference between saying something can gain network power and saying something has a public infrastructural focus. And I think you're seeing this with a lot of open source software, which is... I'm a big supporter of the free software movement. I hope it succeeds. But one of the things I think it made a mistake on, and I think there are really good people making this critique from within the free software movement, people like Alison Macrina at the Library Freedom Project, who you should definitely have on as well, by the way. But the idea that, in the early days, first of all, a lot of the people coming into the free software movement coming out of the 1970s when a lot of the big macro fights had been lost by progressives and micro reasoning was the dominant framework for everybody. And so the idea of framing the benefits of using free software in terms of individual micro benefits and things and saying we're going to stay out of macro politics and things, you could be left leaning, right leaning, it doesn't matter, kind of worked to an extent there, but it also meant that there were less radicals, there were less people of color, there were less women, there were less, there was less concern about those kinds of inclusivity and diversity issues. But it also meant that there was no theory of political economy, which meant that, I've spoken to Eben about this, and his strategy was we'll leverage certain elements of private capital against other elements of private capital. And that works to an extent, and I he did amazing practical work with that. But that's very different to funding public goods and to having a theory of how we should fund public goods. And the other thing I want to mention, which we should get into at some point, is in addition to this idea of money being a public good, I think there's something different about public money than these private money. So I just want to flag that. But to go back to this point, I think I think
that was my initial question, but the alternative discussion we've had instead is also incredibly interesting.
Yeah.
Right.
So with these things like with things like Bitcoin, for me, if you look at what happened in the free software movement, a lot of the people who write free software now do so within corporations who fund them. Yeah. Or there are nonprofits like Linux Foundation that relies on corporate donations. So the entire community now has been driven in a certain direction by the political economy constraints imposed by being workers under capitalism. And if you don't have a theory of an alternative mode of software freedom production, then at best, we are going to see a world where the free software community is Ubuntu brought to you by Canonical, the Linux Foundation brought to you by Microsoft, because those are the people that are paying the bills.
It's interesting.
And that's where I don't think what you're describing actually, it goes deep enough. It has a sort of superficial idea that like I, as someone as a punter on the internet, can log on and log off, but that's not That's not the same as saying like I can opt out of capitalism and make this beautiful free software independent of everything else.
Well, I mean,
it might be a public good. Just the ecosystem is not a public good.
Just a brief retort, and then maybe we should move on, because there is something very interesting at the core of our perspectives that is very different, despite our similarities. I guess one thing I'd say is I'm glad the Bitcoin Foundation failed, and failed miserably. You know, a trade association or a nonprofit that claimed to speak for development of that technology is not something that we really want. And this also came up. A lot of people will know that I'm a board member of the Zcash Foundation, which is a foundation that is separate from the company, the Zcash or electronic coin company, that created the initial Zcash software. And it's meant to be a check against the company as a nonprofit, with the interest of the public in mind, to make sure that the technology is always free and open and protects financial privacy for individuals who want to use it. When we were founding the foundation, there was this debate, we would like to be US based because frankly, most of the developers for Zcash are US based. It wasn't a American hegemony situation or anything like that. It'd be great if things were more international, but like the people are here. So
not intentionally.
Not intentionally. Oh yeah, there's systemic issues that we could get into, but the idea was, okay, so if we're going to be US based and we want to be a nonprofit, we're going to have to go through this IRS approval process. And we have to pick what corporate form we're going to take, or what tax exempt form we're going to take. And unlike the Linux Foundation, and I believe the Bitcoin Foundation, when it still existed, which went the C6 route, which is industry association, which I think is completely wrong for free software, we went the C3 route, which is a public charity. We said, look, we have a public mission. And our lawyers, you'll like this, Rohan, our lawyers told us we shouldn't talk too much about building software then, because the IRS will balk at that. They'll say, how can you be a public charity and build software? Trade associations build software. See the Linux Foundation. It's not a public charity if you're building software. The only thing you should really say on your application is that you're doing public education. Yeah. And I came back and I said, look, and I actually really like our lawyers, so if they're listening, you're awesome. But I said, look, no, in the IRS code, it says that public charities can build public infrastructure. Yeah. And that is what there needs to be public infrastructure online. Without it, we're doomed. Without it, there will be these closed lists of everything you've ever done that'll get subpoenaed by the thought police. And then we're over if we have totalitarianism in any particular Western nation or any nation on Earth. So I completely agree with sort of this uneasiness with potential centralized and private control over the software development process. And I just think we just need to do our best to make that development process as open as possible. And if you can, in a particular jurisdiction like the US, seek out public charities and things to actually help manage that process.
Yeah, I mean, I'm in complete agreement, and I run a 501c3 as well. Actually, I'm the president on the board. But so yeah, I'm familiar with all these issues. But what you're describing is a system whereby the Department of State of the particular state you're chartering in makes a determination based on your corporate charter that you are pursuing that you're pursuing purposes consistent with that charter, and then the federal government is determining that you're pursuing interests consistent with charitable and public purpose. So there is a level of federal control over that, and while in reality nonprofits barely ever lose their nonprofit status, at least in theory there is a conception of public purpose that's being defined. Mm-hmm. But even then, and I say this, in regards to my own nonprofit as well, who chose the board? And you say there are structural factors. Well, this is exactly the kind of thing that differentiates to me the kind of civil society commitment of nonprofits and genuine public institutions. And I think they're both important for the record. I think civil society does provide that bulwark against totalitarianism. I think one thing that coming to America has been quite instructive to me is just the size of the civil sector relative to other countries where.
Where are you from, Rohan?
I'm from Australia.
Oh, okay. Fantastic.
I live in the UK.
I should have guessed from the accent.
Yeah, but just the civil sector and the nonprofit sector's integration with public service provisioning is a lot higher. But in that context, what you're describing is an accountability.
It's sort of de Tocqueville, if you will. We still have this rough and ready private law thing going on, and thank God for that. I mean, we can agree or disagree that public law should be where a lot of things happen, but I think it's valuable.
Yeah, well, I think private law is a kind of public law, to sort of reduce it down. The word private law there doesn't mean law absent the state and public considerations.
Of course, yes.
So I don't see that as sort of like there are people who think we should
racial
create our own
housing
private
covenants and things like that.
yeah, or
Absolutely.
hire your own bouncers to manage private contracts. This is the Murray Rothbard world of private law. Anyway, so to get back to your point, I just think that what you're describing, the accountability mechanism there goes from the non-profit status, the corporate charter, maintaining laws. All those things provide the public accountability. The claim that I hear from private currency advocates, well, if you don't like it, you don't have to use this currency. That has nothing to do with what you're just describing.
Well, so to be clear, I would add that as an extremely important additional check.
I think it's a good check to have for the record. I just think it's not a sufficient condition.
It cannot be sufficient in a world where, and I know you don't love my sort of microeconomics terms of network effects and things like that, but in a world where we have this lock-in potential, even for free and open things, exit can't be the only check on a public good or a service that the public relies on.
Yeah, and so I think that's the question. So public money to me is the money that the state recognizes. And of course, this could even be instruments that are issued privately. For a lot of the 19th century, chartered state banks notes were accepted in payment of taxes by the federal government.
Right.
The effect of that was to give those notes a degree of moneyness. You can do the same thing with mobile money. You can do the same thing with local currencies, which I've actually proposed, having everything from city and state governments through to nonprofits be able to issue their own local currencies and to set that up as an alternative credit system.
Like Ithaca bucks, right?
Yeah, I lived in Ithaca. I went to Cornell. So yeah, that kind of thing. Exactly. But also not just Ithaca bucks, also, an Illinois currency or, the Detroit bucks from the
Too bad we have that Constitution thing.
Yeah, I would love to take that case, actually, because there is an entire system of tax credits that exists right now, which are functionally dollars. And the idea that law would actually be a binding constraint on the issuance of a local currency would have implications for the entire system of tax credits. And I think the business community wouldn't let it happen. So I think that when you actually see the times when this particular provision has been sort of come to the Supreme Court, they usually find ways around it. Like with state banknotes, they said as long as it's partially owned by a private actor, it's fine.
So for those listening who aren't constitutional scholars, we're describing
Article 1, Section 10 prohibits states from issuing anything except gold or silver in payment of taxes. Although very early on with McCulley v. Maryland, one of the first cases you learn in constitutional law, the states chartered their own banks and issued their own banknotes, and the Supreme Court ruled that it was okay for states to issue money through a chartered bank as long as they didn't completely own that chartered bank.
Do we have Hamilton to thank for this too? I just saw the music for the first time. I loved it.
We have Crawford, who's one of the early Treasury secretaries, and we have Justice Story a little bit to thank for it, who actually ran a bank while he was on the Supreme Court, which, go figure.
Those were the good old days, weren't they?
Yeah, exactly. So when we talk about public money, from an MMT point of view, it's that acceptability in payment of legal obligations, whether that's private law, contracts, torts. You go to court and they give you a judgment. Whatever you can pay that judgment in is, it doesn't have to be legal tender, but it has to be acceptable in legal judgments.
So chartalism theory.
Yeah, so this is the MMT chartalist argument. But if you start from that idea, then whatever the state accepts becomes part of the unit of account. Now, there could be multiple currencies in a kind of basket of unit of account, but the idea that when you accept a certain instrument, you determine that the unit of account value structure around the prices denominated in that instrument.
Right. And to get back to the question, so this is what you mean by really publicness of money from.
That's right. So when I say public money, what I'm saying is the money that is integrated into the unit of account system that permeates the entire legal system and is accountable to the public legal system. So like, even when you're talking about Bitcoin, you're saying it's private. Well, if a court says you've broken the law and you go to jail, you can't assert your sovereign Bitcoin hood, right? So you're still under the sovereign rule of law of whatever domestic country you're in. Yeah. Now we can try to, make it easier or less easy for those laws to oppress people and have control over, data and things they shouldn't have. But I think that's very different from saying we could create a private currency that could do what public money does.
Yeah.
And if you accept that premise that public money is qualitatively different, then digital public money is a project that can't be solved with a private money solution.
Right. This is very helpful. And I think the distinction is valuable. It does complicate our work even more. One thing we always have to explain is you can have a public ledger with a privacy protecting cryptocurrency. So what do you call it? Like a public-private? And now we have a third dimension. So the privacy in that case is whether the transactions on the ledger are like encrypted or not, or in some ways visible and reveal the sender and recipient or not. The public in that case is, well, even if it's private transactions, the ledger itself is public or, jointly created by an open set of participants with no gatekeeper. And now we have a third public-private distinction, and the same words for all three of these distinctions, which is money that is effectively recognized by the state for payment of taxes and the legal system and things like that, versus money that is not officially recognized. So now I have to write a backgrounder that says there's three different ways that money can be public or private, and maybe we should have unique words for all of them.
I'll agree with at least one of them then, in the interest of diplomacy. No. I mean, look, and I get your point. I'm not trying to just be a stickler about semantics.
No.
You can use whatever word you want. I think my point is just I'm trying to tease out that there are different problems here, or different like terrains. And I think one of the problems is that a lot of the privacy or private currency oriented people, it's a category error. They think they're solving for something else, and what they're solving might be important. For the record, because I'm concerned about totalitarianism, I think private innovation in currency is a good thing. I think it should be protected and allowed and all this kind of thing. What I don't think is good
public charity, which is kind of private.
Yeah, exactly. What I don't think is, I don't like for profit, for the record. So I don't need any of this to be done with anyone with a balance sheet of over, 6.
We're all going to be using figures. Libra soon, Rohan. Come on.
Exactly. Well, so anyway, my point is just I am not opposed to the development of private currencies, but I do think if we are going to try to address the question of digitization of public money, we need to start with a clear idea of what that problem is. And what I often find in those conversations is you'll say, we should digitize fiat currency. And someone says, fiat currency is doomed. Put all your faith in Bitcoin. And I just think that's not the right way. That's sort of like saying, the fire department is corrupt, buy a fire extinguisher. But like if your whole town is going to burn
we'll
down.
form roving bands of fire extinguishers like they had in New York in the 1800s. Exactly. And we'll hide the fire hydrant from our enemies so that we can get the money instead of them.
Yeah, but even more fundamentally, like if your whole town burns down and you manage to like save your house with a fire extinguisher, like you haven't performed the public service of solving the problem of fires. You know what I'm saying? So with Bitcoin, or private currencies in general, it isn't solving the problems that I see need to be solved to address public money and the digitization of public money.
I don't think I completely. Yeah, I don't think I completely disagree. So one of the things that a lot of the misconceptions we often have to fight against, because of some voices in the Bitcoin community who will be very loud about how fiat is doomed and Bitcoin is the global currency of the future. One of the things we have to fight against then is the statement, well, no, that's a gross oversimplification. It's both empirically seemingly highly unlikely and theoretically maybe undesirable, because do you really want states to have no control over their monetary policy? Now, a lot of these people would say, well, we don't want states at all, and we don't have to have a conversation about anarchy, either left or right anarchy at all right now. But our response is no, it's quite likely that Bitcoin will exist alongside national currencies for the foreseeable future and probably forever, and they can complement each other, just like the ability to purchase hard assets is a good complement to any national currency, because it can be a hedge against inflation. It can be a sort of discipline against inflation and things like that. I said inflation, and now you're.
No. I mean,
I said the word I'm not supposed to say around MMT.
No. I talk about inflation all the time, but I think what you're describing there is, first of all, that like it is good for people who want to hedge against a general risk of the currency, which may not actually be a good thing in public interest at all. If we're all accountable to the same currency, that's a little bit different to like, well, I'll just buy an island in Bermuda and it doesn't matter if the currency collapses because I'm invested in land. I'm not sure if that's the right way to think about social risk of currency collapse, because there are a lot of people who don't own assets, for example. If you're thinking of it, so when you said inflation, and
I just see it assets, as
it's an investor perspective. It's an asset owner perspective. It's not an earner perspective, and it's not a debtor perspective.
No, you're right. I just see it in a very. I'm not making a large political statement.
No. And I wasn't trying to have a go at you. I was just explaining why I had that reaction, because when you said that, I was like, I could totally see what you're saying. If you're a person who owns money and wants to protect the value of that money, you can see it as complementary. If you're the kind of person that thinks that maybe that actually as a social function is less good than other things, maybe what you're describing is less useful than complementary.
But again, the threat of totalitarianism or something like that, like people literally sewed coins into their clothing. People swallowed valuables and like horrible things have happened in the past because of over-reliance perhaps on a single economic system and a diversity of systems, and making some of those portable and open. And
that I agree with. That I completely agree with. I just don't think that is reducible to hard assets, and I don't think that the hard assets might be the right way to do that. But to put that aside, because I want to get to the point about anonymous that you brought up, which is
I'm running this show, but yes, sorry, that's what I want to get to too.
Yeah, no, because I know I went off track a bit. So the anonymity point, if you start from the point of view that I just articulated about public money having its own set of problems, anonymity I think is a good thing. For privacy, for civil liberties, for blah blah blah, and because of that, the next question that comes up to me is: can you achieve all of your goals with respect to private anonymous money with only private monies, or do you need to ensure that the public monetary system has anonymity as well? To give a basic question, imagine if Bitcoin was, widely adopted, really easy, all the little technical quirks and things, and people had generally accepted its underlying value proposition as a currency and payment system.
Go on.
And then someone proposed eliminating cash, the US dollar. Should Bitcoin advocates be agnostic to that question? So they say, it doesn't matter because Bitcoin's working. Or should you say, no, of course this is a good thing. Yeah. Right, okay. So if you think that, and that's the sort of weak version, my stronger version is, you need it, right? You need it. It's an critical part of public monetary infrastructure. And if we get rid of it, we've lost something really fundamental that private currencies couldn't replace.
I think that's right. Peter Todd, who's sometimes a controversial character in our space because he can be a little unsubtle in his critique of technical schemes and vulnerabilities. He's very right about a lot of things, though. And one of the things that has always stuck with me, he once said, Bitcoin is by far a second best solution to cash. He's not an MMT. He's not talking about macroeconomics or geopolitical things. He's saying from a privacy and censorship resistance standpoint, you're still not going to be able to beat something that I can hand to you in person and you can have and I don't have anymore, and nobody necessarily saw this transaction happen. And so we need that, because even Bitcoin, of course, is notoriously public. This blockchain can be fully audited by major, very valuable now startups that do blockchain analysis, and they can essentially pin a name and an address to a series of Bitcoin addresses. But even Zcash and Monero in some ways rely on cryptography and encryption of the transactional data on the blockchain, which in theory could be compromised at some point in the future, especially if this is a permanent and immutable record of all transactions. And that threat alone should say that there's never going to be a solution here that is as good as physical cash. So I completely agree with you on that.
So take that idea, I got two more little steps then. Take the idea from physical cash to digital cash. No, take the same concept from physical to digital. Say we transition to a world where the general accepted view is 98% of transactions are going to be digital, 98% of very important transactions to individuals are going to be digital. Should we not then have something that functions as close to cash to ensure that we don't lose the effective function of cash once we are just not in spaces where we can do it physically? I think we probably agree, yes. And then the last point on that is, well, if that's the case, is there something about how we try to develop the technology of public digital money that would mean we would have to take a different focus than just trying to develop a private digital currency and then saying, oh, here's this technology, central bank of, this country? And I think the answer is yes there. I think maybe that's where the fundamental question comes down to. And sorry for the delay to get there. That's the question I think it comes down to, which is, if you look back to the 90s with Chaum and others back then, there was a sort of strand of research that was focused on mini mints and things that was designed to be DigiCash and others as well.
Zooko was actually very, very close to that early project as well. Zooko from Zcash.
Right. And a lot of those actors began from the idea that we could leave the questions of issuance of the amount of money to a central authority and just work on the private anonymous payment side. Mm-hmm. And it seemed to me, at least at a certain point historically, and I'd be interested to other historians of this space who've got other thoughts on this, but at least from my reads, it seems like at a certain point, a lot of those actors got the impression that there wasn't much interest from public authorities in a digital private anonymous cash at that point.
I think so.
And they turned to private market solutions or private currencies and things to keep pushing technologies that they could actually implement and work on that didn't require waiting for a final approval from a minister of treasury or something.
Yeah. I mean, Chaum was incredibly ahead of his time and might still be. I haven't looked into his newer projects, but
he was a keynote speaker at a conference we organized this at the ITU a few years ago. And he was, the Alexa stuff he's been pushing pretty aggressively. I haven't I'm not entirely convinced.
But DigiCash, minus this mining process and blockchain process to actually create the units and a sort of round robin competition among persons to keep the ledger, the notion that you'd have these certificate based or public private key based, assets, and they'd just be minted by banks and then circulate around is brilliant. But I think, again, the reason it didn't happen is primarily that, why would a bank want to do this? I see no vested self-interest for bankers, and I'm sure you and I can agree that that's probably the case in many situations. And the government probably at this point, you're right, the history of this would be very interesting to find out, but could you have even explained these ideas back in the 90s to the folks in government who would have needed to trust the technology to tell the banks to do this?
There was a surprising amount of blue sky writing I found from the early 90s where they're talking about issues in as relatively broad philosophical terms as we're now hearing with central bank digital currency. Yep. But this was also, remember, happening at the same time as the early internet. So you're literally debating the V chip and whether there should be a regulated internet at all. And so I think a lot of these questions were sucked up into that larger milieu and didn't develop their own distinct identity in terms of digital money, digital payments, which is what we're seeing now. But the reason that's important to me is because as a result of that, a lot of the crypto community went down a path where the technology had to address two questions. It had to address the payments, but it also had to address the monetary issuance question. Mm-hmm. And most of the technology since then has integrated those two in a pretty intrinsic way. And you can say, we can develop a permission system and change the mining rules. But that's still a system of mining where you're just sort of giving someone a key and reducing the energy cost of a particular transaction. And I think that's still different to a system where from the outset, you could trust a centralized issuer, but not trust a centralized payments processor. And I think the technological questions...
Aren't you basically suggesting that we just have... You said you referenced basically a proof of stake type system or a round robin permission type system for signing on the ledger. Wouldn't we just give that key to the government then?
But I'm talking about a system that doesn't keep a ledger of transactions. I'm not talking about a joint ledger. So a system where you have hardware secured devices, for example, and then the hardware secured devices can transact tokens between each other, and those tokens can be validated at certain points in time against a list of tokens that have been issued, but that the actual transactions themselves are not validated. And you can, this is the kind of technology that eCurrency, which I worked on for a bit, has been pushing, although they've now, talked more about surveillance because that's the needs of most central banks. But the point of doing that is that you're separating the validation of the currency from the validation of the transaction. And that's actually what happens with cash. You and I transact with cash, and I rely on the cash instrument to do the validating, not the transaction to do the validating.
Well, I think that's right. But with cash, we have a certain benefit, which is that in physical space, in meat space, double spending is pretty difficult. I mean,
you can
engage in all kinds of efforts to counterfeit bills and things like that, but it has real physical costs in the real world. And you're definitely not going to be able to walk up to two people and hand them, putatively.
I mean, that does happen today. And the way that we deal with that is we have a law enforcement system that tries to keep that down. I mean, the Secret Service is one of the first actors created by the US government precisely for...
So we impose costs through the law, and there are physical costs. I think the problem that Satoshi was solving, and that to a certain extent, directly, Sham was solving with DigiCash, is this double spending problem in virtual space, in cyberspace, where the costs of reproducing any artifact are essentially zero. So anybody can create a copy of this video we're making right now with almost no computing power, and the counterfeiting.
But if you have hardware secured wallets, then that issue has a different valency than if you're talking about a purely software basis.
Although hardware secure wallets have their own vulnerabilities, and that all the hardware.
They do. I agree with that. But
none of them are open source.
I agree with that. Mint Chip, which was the first kind of early prototype digital currency issued by a central bank, was designed to be a hardware secured entity, and it failed in large part because it was closed source and therefore had security vulnerabilities.
Yeah, I don't mean to be a little. I looked into the eCurrency company that you I think your fellow board member on.
No. I consulted with them on a white paper about the way that they described the model of what their technology works. And
okay.
I don't do technology audit.
Okay.
So I did a white paper where they said this is the technology model. If our technology doesn't meet this model, then our technology is inferior.
I see. Yeah, because
it should be designed.
I looked at the white paper, and I was fairly perturbed that I didn't find any details about how they're actually leveraging hardware secure elements to prevent double spending, which they're using. And there's a lot of references to patents in that white paper too.
So this is an example. This is an example of why I don't think market-based driven public currency technology development is the right way to go, because I might actually agree with a lot of their motivations. They came into this wanting to create an instrument that was function like a bearer instrument, not an account-based app. Yeah. And the way to do that, at least as far as I've understood, is if you use a combination of hardware secure wallets, zero key cryptography, or zero knowledge proofs, and you separate the central issuer maintaining the ledger of all instruments outstanding from a decentralized network of transaction validators, that the protocol that validates the transaction can still be a public good and can be regulated, so that the hardware secure wallets don't talk to each other except through that protocol.
And we probably shouldn't get into this because I can't read their white paper, and I've never. I don't want to defend. I don't want to defend. Describes what you're looking at. I will say that you've said in a couple other places that you don't think blockchain is the answer because it's always going to be an account-based system rather than a token-based system.
I think it's always going to be a ledger-based system.
Right, a ledger which has entries which are in some ways analogous to accounts, especially if you can group them and forensically analyze them the way Chainalysis.
I think a system, another way to describe that is I don't want to have any centralized ledger of all transactions.
Even if it's a decentralized, but
even if it's decentralized,
highly redundant.
I don't want any record of every transaction ever made. I want dark transactions.
I think it's a laudable goal, but I'm not sure that exists full stop in technology right now, short of a massive breakthrough. Because this was the breakthrough of the Bitcoin scheme, which was that we are going to assume that this will be some sort of immutable permanent ledger, and maybe it could even be made private with encryption. And the only way we can make those assumptions, they are assumptions and sort of a legal fiction, like a corporation is a person or something like that, because we're presuming that there are disinterested persons maintaining that ledger, and therefore they have very little power to actually create fraud on that ledger or manipulate it because of the incentives we've set up. We've got competitive mining. We've got, transaction validation is just checking digital signatures. It's not actually looking at someone's ID, all that. And so we try and build this tech stack that obfuscates or destroys the ability of those keeping the central ledger to do anything. And as far as I know, even if you were using hardware secure elements and zero knowledge proofs, you're still going to have some sort of distributed database to check against to make sure that transactions aren't being double spent. And it'll exist on all of the hardware secure elements. And we're using then another method of presuming that thing doesn't exist by using encryption, by using hardware secure elements.
It doesn't need to be on all hardware elements. That can be managed by the central authority.
Then we're presuming that the central authority isn't misusing their ability to offer some sort of approval. Yes, this is a genuine transaction, not a fraud.
Yes, no, and that I will embrace. That I think is a legitimate limitation on what we're talking about, because that's exactly what currency is. Think about what's the difference between issuing a counterfeit $10 bill and issuing a legal tender $10 bill. As a lawyer, think as like a Holmesian legal realist here. What's the difference? The difference is you take someone to court, one of them is going to get you sent to jail and the other isn't. Who makes that determination? A court.
Right, but
So the determination of what is and what isn't a counterfeit instrument in public money is a matter of public.
But then we're screwed.
No, we're not screwed. We're not screwed. I don't. Well,
in a way, we're screwed. We were talking earlier about the problem of totalitarianism.
Yeah.
Then this solution doesn't fix that. We still need Bitcoin to fix that.
Well, I don't think that Bitcoin fixes it, but I don't think that this fixes it on its own. I agree.
We need Bitcoin as one avenue to possibly fix that.
Well, I won't even stipulate to that, and I apologize if that's combative.
Bitcoin, Rohan.
Yeah. But what I mean is that, in a public monetary system, the state could just shut down the courts entirely, and at that point, I could go rob your house and steal the Bitcoin wallet that you have and just torture you. So there's a point at which if the state refuses to provide basic functions, then a lot of these systems that we're talking about cease to work as advertised. Right?
You won't get argument from me on that.
So what I'm talking about here is that the state has the ability to maintain the monetary system, and if it chooses to not do that, then that is a totalitarian move. But that's also, I don't think, a risk that can be addressed within the technology system. That's where you get out in the streets.
See, I don't know if we can talk about a system as actually being an anonymous digital fiat system if it relies on a central authority in the middle.
It doesn't. No. That's what I'm talking about. It doesn't rely on a central authority in the middle. It relies on a central authority to validate units of currency. That's a different thing. You and I could transact a counterfeit dollar bill, right? It's only later when I take it to the bank and ask is this counterfeit that the state would have to be involved there. Now, those two practices could happen immediately after each other, right? They could happen even 2 steps of the same commercial transaction. I go to you, you make a transaction, and then I take that currency and ask it to be validated, right? Now, that is different from me and you having to ask the central authority permission before we transact.
But right? I think that process is going to have to happen extremely often in any digital system. No,
it absolutely.
Because otherwise, until the recipients of the, say, 3 times duplicated digital certificate, until one of them goes and says, has this been transferred before? None of the 3 of them know that they actually have provenance.
Sure. No, I agree.
Again, that's not as big of a problem in the physical world because it's hard to actually counterfeit because of physical realities in addition to legal realities. Whereas in the digital world, this could be done at such massive scale through bots that you'd constantly be phoning home to check the validity of a transfer. And at that point, if you don't have a decentralized ledger with zero knowledge proofs or something like it to actually handle that validation process, you're putting an amazing amount of power into the hands of the person that does the validation.
I'm not convinced.
Censor.
I hear that narrative a lot. I'm not convinced about it. I'm not convinced that I'm just letting you know, I'm not convinced that the reason that physical cash is different here is because of the physical cost of counterfeiting. You look at the historical examples of mass scale counterfeiting, like the Civil War. It was counterfeiting was fine. It was very easy to counterfeit at that point. It wasn't to do with physical difficulties there. It was to do with who controlled the political, landscape at the time.
That's fine. But even if that's the case, then Bitcoin is way better than physical cash because it's actually much harder to counterfeit than physical cash.
Well, aside from all the other problems, aside from the gaping hole in the middle of your head, you look really good today, But like, I think what I'm talking about here is if you can have a system where you can transact these coins or these tokens or these certificates anonymously, the question of validating these certificates against a central ledger of barcodes of outstanding notes or of replacing them. Now, just to give an example, if you had 2 wallets, and think about wallets for a second as bespoke banknotes. You had 2 wallets of different amounts, $57 and $43. You wanted to dissolve them into a single $100 wallet, right? Without transacting to anyone else, you could send a message to the central authority and say, I've got X wallet and Y wallet, and I'd like to merge them into Z wallet. And if the central authority in that situation just knows that X wallet has this series of barcodes, which are encrypted, so the central bank doesn't know which one on its list it is, it's just a list, and this other wallet has this other list, it can devalidate those 2 wallet IDs and create you a new ID in that moment and say, okay, those old lists, those old barcodes are no longer valid. These are the new barcodes.
Sure, but if they can track your IP address or any other metadata related to your request for that transaction and match it against this ledger that they have of validated and now non-validated serial numbers, they can do the same kind of forensic analysis.
So that's where things like batching and a Tor style of washing of transactions and things come in.
Or ideally zero knowledge proofs. So this is one thing that I think a lot of people
zero knowledge proofs as well
don't appreciate about Zcash, and I don't mean to shill Zcash.
No.
Sometimes I get accused of that. I just think it's good tech, and I actually own a de minimis amount. It's weird that happened, but that's actually true. So the cool thing about Zcash is we were talking about how blockchain is this. It's analogous to an account-based system because there's a central ledger, and that is worrying. But with respect to shielded transactions, it's worth noting that it's not as if there are a bunch of atomistic transactions that describe sender and recipient and amount sent and they're just encrypted. And therefore, if the encryption breaks, the privacy breaks. That's not how Zcash works. To a certain extent, that's how Monero works, because they use ring signatures to sort of muddle all of the signatures together, and maybe you could then decrypt into individual signatures. But Zcash doesn't do that. When you make a shielded transaction on Zcash, you form a proof, a mathematical proof that according to past records on the blockchain, this is not a double spent transaction. So you're just giving the answer to a very specific mathematical equation. Prove to me that you haven't double spent this. And that's all that ends up on the blockchain. So to me, your concern about blockchains being an account-based system are actually pretty well mollified by the fact that with a zero knowledge proof system, there aren't any accounts actually. The shielded pool is just a series of proofs. And if the encryption breaks in Zcash, and this is worth stressing, if the encryption breaks in Zcash, anyone will be able to counterfeit, but they won't lose privacy. So encryption is bad for Zcash, because then anybody will be able to convince somebody that they've received a Zcash or sent a Zcash. But at the very least, the record of so-called immutable transactions throughout all history will not suddenly become public. It's actually pretty good tech for that reason.
Yeah, well, so two things. One is that's exactly the kind of thing that I could imagine being incorporated into the validation side of what I was just discussing. But the critical thing and the critical point of what I was just talking about, which what I was trying to get at to, is that is a different process from you and I approving the transaction in a decentralized way. There are examples across history, for example, of states failing and people continuing to use the notes and circulating them.
What is it, the Iranian dinar?
Yeah, that's right. So you could imagine situations where, for example, the central bank blows up, but that payments network that was established keeps working, and someone just sets up a different validation system for a new set of certificates get injected into that system, right? So what I'm talking about in the digital cash system, on one hand is anonymous payments, and on the other is still that public money. But having when I use you probably saw the interview I did with David Beckworth, I use the metaphor of someone going into the bank and getting change as like the default transaction for the central bank validation side. For the other side, it's two private actors who don't know each other and you need all the kind of private keys and things. But for the government, it's the equivalent of someone walking in with a balaclava, handing over 2 bags of money.
Government's gonna be totally okay with that.
I know, right? Well, I said to Joe Weisenthal on the Bloomberg podcast the other day that we'll know this crisis is over when you're not allowed to walk into a bank with a mask without getting tackled and arrested anymore. But the idea that you could go into a bank, with no identifying features, hand over 2 bags of money that they don't count, and they don't even look at the barcodes, but they put it on a machine that does the zero knowledge scan, says, okay, these are legitimate barcodes, and they put it on a scale and says the amount in here equals the amount that we're going to give you a new one.
Yeah, really, you're walking in with nothing but a mathematical proof, and they have knowledge of how that proof is constructed. They have some shared secret at the beginning, like a trusted setup, maybe even no trusted setup for better ZK snarks and things like that. And then all they're doing is checking the math. That's great. And as a sort of self-promotion, at Rohan's urging, I'll actually it was definitely from our conversation on Twitter. I asked Matt Green, who's a cryptographer from Johns Hopkins and one of the original co-authors of the Zcash Zero Coin paper. I asked Matt Green to co-author with me just a statement that said, look, you can leverage these things to create central bank digital currencies. And without them, do we actually even want central bank digital currencies? Because without these zero knowledge proofs, this thing becomes a mechanism for totalitarian control. Yeah.
Well, that gets us back to your point about Zcash, which is I actually talk about Zcash quite positively a lot. I use that as an example of ones that I support. But I would say it's precisely the shielded transaction tech that you're describing is why I can do that. It's not the blockchain. And so when people say blockchain will solve X, Y, Z, what they're talking about is the particular architecture of a distributed blockchain is what allows us to achieve blah, blah, blah.
Well, so
I don't think that's true. I think it's the privacy stuff you're talking about.
But you'll never get an argument out of me that blockchain is an overrated term. In fact, it's a term that means essentially nothing because it's so overused these days. We've got a couple of resources on our website that I can't tell people to read enough because they're like, do you really need a blockchain for this? What does a blockchain even mean? We talk about, well, it's a tech stack that includes peer-to-peer networks, consensus mechanisms, and some sort of governance process to determine what the software is. Anyway, on that topic, I lost my train of thought. I don't know.
Well, so my point was just that I think that oftentimes blockchain is being posited as a solution to a particular problem, often of centralized control. Whereas in my point of view, if you're talking about a genuine anonymous public currency, like I was just talking about, where you had a payments network that was decentralized anonymous and a currency validation system that was extremely zero knowledge based, you wouldn't need a blockchain in that. So you don't need the blockchain.
I remembered it. You might want a distributed ledger of proofs, which may not look quite like a blockchain because it's just a bunch of proof data. It's not account-based.
Yeah, you could have a bunch of regional reserve banks or even commercial banks have a copy of that the banknote.
I think you don't just want, you almost certainly need, because the one thing that you would lose if it was really just a single central authority validating proofs, you might have strong privacy guarantees from that system. You do not have strong liveness guarantees. If they choose to stop validating proofs because, say, habeas corpus is suspended or it's a revolution or a coup, then you're screwed. And so that's the great value of competitive mining, whether it's through staking or through proof of work or things like that, that I don't know if I'm not saying that government-backed fiat digital money needs to have competitive mining. We just need to understand that it might be private, but it won't have the liveliness guarantees that.
So one way I think at least this is what the e-currency people said. And again, I'm going on the way that they describe their technology as working. And if it doesn't work as advertised, I have no loyalty to it. And I don't like the patent closed proprietary nature of it because it does get in the way of exactly these kinds of conversations.
Yeah.
Everybody I've spoken to at central banks who has done audits of them said it works as advertised for what that's worth. But again, for what that's
not worth. How we want to. Yeah.
No, of course not how we want to do any of this stuff. But to get to your point there, like the having a decentralized set of actors who can do the validation process on behalf of the central bank, I think is better for resilience, no question. What the e-currency people were talking about was embedding that actually into the protocol itself of the transaction, and then having that protocol hard baked into the hardware devices. And so in that situation, it wouldn't even be the central bank that would do the validation. It would be the hardware store, and then that database of encrypted that encrypted barcodes could even be made public. It could just be public data.
Start to be more comfortable with if we had open source hardware secure elements and we had more rigorous testing of them. They're still very new. It's like Intel kind of runs the show here,
which is why I work with the Freedom Box guys. Why I support BeagleBone, Black, all those kinds of entities, because we do need the hardware dimension to catch up. And when I spoke to the e-currency people, they working through the SIM card system. Their natural obvious thought, because a lot of them came from the mobile money background, was, well, we already have a hardware secured device. It's the SIM card. If we can just bake this into the SIM card protocol standards, we actually have done 90% of the work. And that's actually the way that the ITU has been working on setting up a lot of the messaging protocol standards, which they're responsible for developing. They're the ones that have like public key encryption standards that correspond to, maybe they maintain those.
Maybe we can get into that in a future episode. I just realized we're already at an hour. This conversation went by super quickly for me, but we're not obligated to keep this to just an hour. So I do want to switch gears real quick.
Sure.
Would you mind helping our listeners understand briefly the work you did with Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib on minting the coin and actually sneaking in? I mean, it was a public bill, but I feel like you kind of snuck in some of the first public statements about lawmakers wanting anonymous cash.
I mean, thanks. I appreciate that. Awesome. I hoped I was, doing something useful on that. Yeah. So we had been working on some automatic stabilizer legislation before COVID, and then that translated into a COVID emergency relief bill. And the focus of the Congresswoman and her team was to get this money out to as many people as possible, to not try to limit it to people who were American citizens or something. Accounts. Yeah. And to people who have bank accounts. So to get it out as fast as possible to as many people as possible. And to avoid all the hand wringing about, adding to the national debt and things that justifies, post-crisis austerity reactionary backlash.
Like 2009, yeah.
Like 2009, yeah, like the Deficit Reduction Commission and, fix the debt and the Tea Party and everything else. And so we designed it to be a $2,000 per month for the duration of the crisis and $1,000 per month thereafter for a year. To every person equally, man, woman, child, citizen, non-citizen, anyone who's here for more than 3 months. You can get it by signing an affidavit if you don't have identification, and there's a lot of privacy protections to that database of affidavits. We created a system that primarily used prepaid US debit cards, but also did direct deposit and had an emergency responder corps that would go out to at-risk populations and do a wellness check and then give the cards to them physically.
Which makes total sense. Leverage the tech that works right now, because we're not going to try and build something during a crisis.
Exactly. we also had a system of places you could go to pick up the cards, etc. And we set it up so that it would be funded via minting $1 trillion platinum coin under a provision of the Coinage Act. The funds would go into the Treasury's account. The Fed was actually also authorized to issue its own securities so that it could continue to keep the mix of securities to reserves in the banking system, whatever it wanted. So instead of the Treasury issuing securities, the Fed issuing cash and offsetting part of it, the Treasury issues the cash, the Fed issues the securities and offsets part of it. It just switches the responsibilities around. But in doing so, it gives the Fed a lot more flexibility to achieve its objectives. And critically, Federal Reserve securities don't count towards the national debt, so it's not borrowing. It's very clear that the purpose of issuing those securities is for monetary policy purposes, not for funding purposes. And we ring-fenced any losses on the Fed's balance sheet to a special account so that it wouldn't even affect remittances.
No, but you also included this section later on. Which
I'm just getting to that, which is, So there's been a move towards public bank accounts through postal banks on one hand, and I support that movement. Colleagues of mine work on that. And through setting up central bank accounts for all, which I also support and have written about. And so those were included in there to transition out in the future the system of prepaid debit cards, because the system of prepaid debit cards is run through the Bureau of Fiscal Service at the Treasury, but it is managed through a partnership with a commercial bank called MetaBank, and there's another bank as well that does a different.
So they're holding all those deposits, and
they're holding them in a float, and they issue these debit cards in sort of special purpose accounts. Some of them are numbered because they've got a relationship with the Treasury where they can issue numbered cards rather than ID-based cards.
So for you, ideally, this wouldn't be the back end. The back end would be actual accounts at the Fed.
Exactly. But then you get to the question of accounts at the Fed and who gets to own one. Then there's the know your customer, anti-money laundering. So I said it's not good enough. One of the benefits of prepaid cards is I could go up, give them no ID, get this card, get it out in cash and go spend it. So we made the prepaid cards able to be withdrawn in cash. And we put a provision in that in addition to setting up these Fed accounts, the federal government and the Treasury in particular, because the Treasury has always been in charge of the notes and the instruments and the coins, the Fed does accounts, the Treasury does these other kinds of instruments. And also, I think that the Treasury is a more inherently political body, and that a lot of these questions around privacy and stuff are too important to be squirreled away behind closed doors at a central bank and left to central bankers to make decisions about.
Yeah.
So we set up that the Treasury would be empowered to create a digital e-cash system. They would be based on open hardware, wallets, and protocols, and would have no fees, and would we established a digital financial privacy board at the Treasury that would ensure that the development of this technology retains the anonymity preserving features of digital cash as closely as possible, and prohibited backdoors. We said preserve the anonymity features of physical currency transactions as much as possible.
That's tremendous. Yeah.
So that's not a clear set of rules, but it does set a clear guide, direction.
I thought it was a little odd that it took place in a sense of Congress section of the law rather than but that's not a strong criticism. I just think as an initial foray.
Watch this space in the sense that this was not the bill to write the whole proposal for that, but that was to open the door. And because what's going on is that, Congresswoman Tlaib is a member of the House Financial Services Committee, but then the chair of the committee is Congresswoman Maxine Waters, and then of course Nancy Pelosi is the speaker. And so Congresswoman Tlaib can propose an individual bill, but there's also the bill that comes out of her committee, and then there's also the bill that the Democrats propose at the House level. So you can kind of put everything you want in your bill, and then you try to get the stuff in the next bill and then the next bill. And then sometimes there's a trade-off between how much you put in your own bill that's different from the others in terms of influence. So when it comes to, for example, there was a debate in the general Democratic Party to set up Fed accounts. Other senators and other Congress people proposed other versions of doing so. Part of the point of this bill was to sort of make sure that eCash wasn't left behind. And the Congresswoman has proposed, is working on other bills related to stablecoin regulation and eCash specifically and public banking. So there's a range of things coming in this space. Yeah.
I'll say that getting some sort of radical but excellent idea on paper and as a real bill is always a tremendous undertaking, even if it doesn't become law immediately, and even if it's just a sense of Congress. And it's what brought us together, because that's when we noticed you. And we're very grateful, and it allowed this conversation and hopefully many future conversations. And, Coin Center is a nonpartisan organization. We do, however, have plenty of Bitcoin interested advocates on the more libertarian right side of the debate, like perhaps Congressman Emmer, who I think we could get behind this notion. So a grand coalition, it's going to be hard, but I would love to work with you and your organizations to make that happen.
Yeah, I've got some things working now, and that I'll definitely bring you into and touch base after this. The other thing I just want to last quick pitch is, we're talking about the technology here, and I think that's really important. And I never claim to be the technologist here, but from my point of view, there's a sort of deeper layer, which is the political commitment and the commitment to build the technology. And that's the fight that we need to win first, because if we can't even agree that we want it, then we can't even debate whether it's achievable in 5 minutes, or maybe it's a pipe dream for the next 6 months or whatever. And I think this is where I'm really appreciative of that blog post you wrote, and or that article you wrote, and in general your interest in this space, and the people your colleagues are bringing into this space, because the more people from the private world who actually are doing the work to take the technology that you've brought and think about it, or to design systems that use the things that you've already done, but then take out the parts that are unnecessary when we're thinking about public money, or that are could be designed better given the constraints.
And we're going to have a vibrant debate about what those parts are.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the conversation.
But I think that's the first
should have been having
priority
since DigiCash, since Chom. Exactly. We should have been talking about this.
That's where we were 100% on the same page. Yeah. If we had not sort of given up on cash, we maybe be further ahead in this conversation, and we can't keep wasting time.
I think so. Well, this is a perfect place to leave it off, I think. Rohan, we're going to have you back at least once or twice, probably many more, I hope, if we keep
looking
doing
forward to
these
it.
Podcasts.
It's lovely to sort of meet you face to face and everything. Take it easy.
Yeah, likewise. Have a good one.
Bye.